I didn't vanish suddenly. No one would have noticed if I had. I disappeared the way fog does, quietly, gradually, without resistance, until one day I realized I was no longer fully here, and no one around me had any idea. That's the strangest part. My life kept moving. I showed up. I answered messages. I smiled at the right moments. I fulfilled obligations. From the outside, everything looked intact. From the inside, something essential had already stepped away. There was no single trauma that started it. No dramatic event I could blame. That would have been easier. Instead, it began with exhaustion, not physical, but existential. The kind that sleep doesn't touch. I remember the first time I felt it clearly. I was listening to someone talk, someone I cared about, and I realized I wasn't absorbing a word. Not because I was distracted, but because I felt strangely absent. Like my body was there, nodding politely, while my awareness hovered somewhere behind it. That moment passed. I dismissed it. Everyone zones out sometimes. But it kept happening. I started feeling like a ghost in conversations. I would speak, hear my own voice, and feel no connection to the words. Decisions were made, plans discussed, futures outlined, and I participated as if reading from a script I hadn't written. I told myself I was just tired. Overstimulated. Burned out. Those explanations were comfortable. They didn't require action. Days stacked neatly on top of each other. Weeks passed. Months followed. I was present enough not to alarm anyone, including myself. That's how disappearance works when it's internal. I stopped noticing time. Not in a poetic way, in a dangerous one. Mornings blurred into evenings. Weekdays into weekends. I lived in a constant state of later, postponing everything that required presence. I stopped asking myself questions. What do I want? How do I feel? Is this life mine? Those questions felt heavy. Inconvenient. Like opening doors I didn't have the energy to walk through. So I didn't. I learned to function on autopilot. To respond appropriately. To perform engagement without actually engaging. People praised my calm. My stability. My ability to handle things. If they had known how hollow that calm was, they might have been worried. But hollow looks exactly like control from the outside. I didn't feel sad enough to be concerned. I didn't feel bad enough to justify change. I was just muted. That's the most dangerous state of all. At some point, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had felt genuinely excited about something. Not anxious excitement. Not nervous anticipation. Real interest. Curiosity. Desire. The absence was subtle but absolute. I watched other people talk about their passions, their frustrations, their dreams, and I felt like an observer. Not envious. Not bitter. Just distant. Like someone watching life through thick glass. I told myself this was maturity, that intense emotions were for earlier stages of life. That neutrality meant balance. But balance doesn't feel empty. The first panic didn't come as panic. It came as a thought. If this is what the rest of my life feels like, I don't think I can do it. That thought scared me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was calm. Observational. It didn't demand attention, it stated a fact. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That nothing was wrong, and that was the problem. Instead, I adjusted further. I minimized needs. Lowered expectations. I learned how little of myself I could give and still pass as present. People adapted to that version of me quickly. They didn't notice my absence because I had trained them not to expect much from me emotionally. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because they failed me, but because I had succeeded too well at disappearing. I began to understand something unsettling: you don't need to leave your life to abandon it. You can stay exactly where you are and still step away internally. And once you do, returning is not simple. The voice inside me, the one that used to react, to question, to resist, had grown quiet. Not gone. Just faint. Like a signal struggling through interference. I worried that if I waited too long, I wouldn't hear it at all. That fear lingered in the background of everything I did. Not urgent enough to force change. Not quiet enough to ignore. I was suspended between existence and absence, and I didn't yet know which one would win. But I was starting to realize this wasn't a phase. It was a slow disappearance. And if I didn't interrupt it, one day I would wake up to a life that looked complete and feel nothing at all inside it. Once I noticed the disappearance, I couldn't stop tracking it. I began measuring my days not by events, but by absences. How little I reacted. How rarely something stirred me. How often I caught myself staring at nothing in particular, suspended in a quiet detachment that felt almost medical. I wasn't unhappy. That was the problem. Unhappiness would have given me direction. Anger would have demanded change. Even grief would have meant I was still connected to something I had lost. What I felt instead was neutrality so complete it erased contrast. Everything flattened into the same emotional temperature. I started forgetting things. Not important facts, feelings. I couldn't recall what excitement felt like without imagining it intellectually. I knew, in theory, that I used to want things. I just couldn't access the sensation anymore. People around me adjusted to the new me without comment. That hurt in a quiet way. It meant my absence was convenient. I was easier now. Less demanding. Less complicated. I required no emotional calibration. That's when a disturbing thought first crossed my mind: what if this version of me is preferable to everyone else? I pushed that thought away. But it came back often. I noticed how conversations flowed around me instead of with me. I contributed when necessary, nodded when expected, laughed when appropriate. No one asked follow-up questions anymore. No one lingered. I had become background. At night, I lay awake trying to remember when this started. I searched for a turning point, a decision, a compromise, a betrayal of self I could point to and say, that's where I left. But there was no single door I had walked through. There were hundreds of small ones, and I had closed each behind me gently. The realization was terrifying. I hadn't disappeared because life overwhelmed me. I disappeared because I made myself smaller to fit it. I had learned to preempt disappointment. To reduce desire before it could be denied. To mute expectation before it could be unmet. Over time, that self-protection turned into self-erasure. I started to feel panic in moments that required authenticity. When someone asked a personal question. When I was expected to care deeply. When I needed to choose without external guidance. My mind would stall. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't trust it. Trust is the first thing to go when you abandon yourself repeatedly. I tried to fix it quietly. Mindfulness. Exercise. Reading. Productivity. I followed all the respectable paths to recovery. They helped my body. They sharpened my focus. They did nothing for the emptiness. Because the problem wasn't stress. It was absence of authorship. I wasn't living reactively, I was living residually. Carrying forward decisions made years ago by versions of myself who no longer existed. I had inherited a life without questioning whether I still consented to it. That realization triggered the first real breakdown. It happened in a public place, during an ordinary moment. Someone asked me to make a simple choice. Nothing important. 2 options. Both fine. And I froze. My chest tightened. My thoughts scattered. My hands trembled slightly. I felt exposed, as if someone had asked me to prove I existed. I chose randomly. The moment passed. No one noticed. But something inside me collapsed. That night, I sat alone and felt a wave of grief unlike anything I had known. Not sharp. Not explosive. Deep and heavy, like mourning someone who had died slowly and quietly while everyone assumed they were still alive. I realized I was grieving myself. The person I used to be curious, reactive, emotionally available hadn't vanished suddenly. They had been neglected. Ignored. Talked over. Replaced by efficiency and endurance. And I had helped it happen. That guilt was overwhelming. Not guilt for failing others, guilt for abandoning myself while pretending I was being responsible. I understood then that disappearance isn't passive. It's an action repeated daily, choosing silence over truth, comfort over alignment, functioning over feeling. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. The question became unavoidable: could I come back, not reinvent myself, not dramatically change everything? Just return, inhabit my own life again, feel present inside it, respond instead of perform. The answer terrified me. Because returning would require disruption. Questions. Explanations. Possibly loss. I would have to admit that the version of me people knew was incomplete. That my stability had been hollow. That my silence had not meant peace. And worse, I wasn't sure I still had the skills. Emotional muscles weaken when unused. Desire atrophies. Voice fades. What if I tried to return and found nothing left? That fear almost kept me absent forever. But something else had begun to grow alongside it, a quiet urgency. Not panic. Not hope. A sense that time was no longer neutral. That each day I remained detached made re-entry harder. I started noticing moments when the world broke through. A song that stirred something unexpected. A sentence in a book that landed too close. A memory that surfaced uninvited and hurt in a way that felt alive. Those moments frightened me and anchored me. They proved that I wasn't gone. Just buried. The dilemma sharpened into something I could no longer postpone. I could continue disappearing politely, becoming more acceptable and less real with each passing year. Or I could risk being disruptive to others and to myself and try to return. There was no third option. No gradual fade out that didn't end in complete absence. I stood at that threshold, aware that whatever I chose next would define whether I remained a shadow in my own life or stepped back into it, unsteady and exposed. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something unmistakable. Fear, yes. But also presence. Coming back didn't feel like waking up. It felt like learning how to breathe after years of shallow air. I didn't announce my return to myself with dramatic vows or sudden clarity. I started with something smaller, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't. Not publicly. Internally. I allowed discomfort to exist without immediately explaining it away. That alone was destabilizing. For years, I had lived in a careful balance, numb enough not to hurt, functional enough not to alarm anyone. Stepping out of that equilibrium felt like sabotage. My body reacted with anxiety, my mind with doubt. Every honest reaction felt exaggerated, inappropriate, unsafe. Presence is overwhelming when you've been absent for too long. I began noticing how much effort it took to feel. Sadness hit harder than I remembered. Joy arrived awkwardly, almost suspicious. I didn't trust any of it. I had lived so long in emotional neutrality that intensity felt like danger. But numbness, I was learning, is not safety. It's postponement. People noticed changes before I named them. I was quieter in some ways, sharper in others. Less agreeable. Less smooth. More real. That shift unsettled some of them. They asked if I was okay. If something had happened, if I was going through something. I didn't know how to explain that nothing had happened, and that was exactly the problem. Some relationships adjusted. Some strained. A few faded. That hurt more than I expected, not because I regretted changing, but because it confirmed what I had feared: my absence had been convenient. Being present made me heavier to carry. There were moments I wanted to disappear again. The old strategy was tempting. Numbness had been easy. It required nothing. Presence demanded choice, and choice demanded responsibility. But something had shifted permanently. Once you realize you are disappearing, you can't unknow it. You can't return to absence without feeling the violence of it. I started making decisions slowly. Poorly, sometimes. I said yes when I meant no. I said no when I didn't yet know what I wanted instead. I learned that clarity doesn't arrive before action, it follows it. That was terrifying. I grieved the time I had lost. Not with drama, but with a steady, aching awareness. Years spent maintaining a life I didn't fully inhabit. Moments lived at a distance. Emotions diluted before they reached me. That grief didn't ask to be resolved. It asked to be acknowledged. So I let it sit. The biggest change wasn't external. My life didn't suddenly transform. The change was internal and subtle. My days began to register. I felt myself inside them. I noticed the passage of time again, not as something slipping away, but as something moving with me. I began trusting my reactions, even when they were inconvenient. Especially then. I learned that disappearing had never protected me from pain. It had only protected others from my complexity. That realization reshaped everything. I no longer aimed to be easy, or adaptable, or quietly impressive in my ability to endure. I aimed to be present even when that meant being uncertain, emotional, unfinished. Some people stayed. Others didn't. That loss still hurts. But it hurts in a way that feels honest. And honesty, I've learned, is grounding. If I have one confession left, it's this: I didn't disappear because life was too much. I disappeared because I stopped believing my inner experience mattered. Coming back wasn't about reinvention. It was about consent. About choosing, day after day, to inhabit my own life even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disrupts, even when it costs me. The danger isn't losing yourself suddenly. It's fading so slowly that no one notices, not even you. I came back before I vanished completely. Not heroically. Not gracefully. But deliberately. And that decision, fragile, ongoing, imperfect, is the first real proof I have that I am here. Still here.